For as long as Jews have been telling our story, one question has lingered in every generation. How do you hold on to faith without shutting off your mind? Today, I want to share my own journey with that question, how I wrestle with belief, doubt, and tradition, and why I think that very struggle is at the heart of Judaism itself. I'm Amiel Cohen, and I help people connect the puzzle pieces of life to find clarity. I was raised Orthodox. I still live in that world, halachically, communally, culturally. But over time, I've realized that my relationship with Judaism, with Torah, and with God isn't that simple. And it's definitely not neatly packaged the way I was originally taught. I believe in God. I believe the Torah is rooted in divine revelation. And yet, I don't take every line of the text as literal history. My faith isn't about shutting off my brain. It's about wrestling with it. And oddly enough, that struggle has actually deepened my connection. There was a time when I carried more anger than faith. Not necessarily at God, because honestly, I wasn't even sure he was there. It was more anger at the world and how thin and rigid the religious explanations felt. They didn't hold up, but it wasn't rebellion. It was intellectual frustration. And slowly through study, through reflection, through time, I began to build a different kind of belief, one that could live outside critical thinking. People like Rabbi Joshua Berman helped. So did Jordan Peterson. They reframed the Torah for me not as a rule book or a ledger of ancient events, but as something alive, psychologically rich, spiritually deep, rooted in divine encounter, but shaped through human experience. And that door opened. Suddenly, I could believe in the stories, not necessarily word for word, but in essence. Take the splitting of the sea. Do I believe it actually happened as described? No. But do I believe something happened? Something real? Maybe it was natural. Maybe it was miraculous. Maybe both. But it left such a mark that it became part of who we are. And that's how I've come to see much of Torah, not as fiction, not as journalism, but as sacred memory, a national recollection of moments when the divine broke through, shaped by time, language, and the limits of human understanding. And you know what's funny? That view of all things made the Torah feel more true to me, not less. Once I let go of the idea that the Torah had to be literal to be meaningful, I started asking a different kind of question. Not, did this really happen exactly as written, but where did this come from? What is it trying to say? That's when I came across something from Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardoza that really stuck with me. He said, when we say the Torah is min hashamayim, from heaven, it doesn't mean Moses sat down and took dictation like a stenographer. What was given at Sinai, or wherever that moment of revelation actually took place, wasn't a manuscript. It was raw material. It was the wheat. And it was the Jewish people, through memory, reflection, generations of writing and interpreting, who baked the bread. We created a sacred text that reflects not just the divine, but our response to the divine. To me, that metaphor captures something essential. Revelation wasn't just a transmission, it was process. And the Torah, rather than being weakened by its human fingerprints, is actually elevated by them. Because it means God didn't just ask us to speak, he spoke through us. And we became partners in shaping the tradition that would carry that voice through time. But I won't lie, thinking this way has a cost. When you believe the Torah was filtered through human hands, you don't get to fall back on the easy answer. You can't always say, well, God said it, so that's the end of the discussion. You have to ask harder questions. Did we hear this correctly? Is it truly divine? Or is this the best our ancestors could do in responding to what they experienced. But even with those questions, I still believe that the core of it is right, that what we received, the stories, the structure, the system, is rooted in something real. Maybe the Torah was perfect for the generation that received it. Maybe it still is, and in ways we haven't fully understood yet. But that doesn't mean we're done. Revelation didn't stop. It continues through our learning, our questions, our willingness to engage with the text and with ourselves. The Torah isn't frozen in time. It's alive. And maybe that's part of what makes it perfect. As I continue down this path, holding reverence for the Torah while also seeing its complexity, I found myself in a strange position. Theologically, I couldn't accept a literalist reading of Scripture. But practically, spiritually, communally, I still felt closest to the Orthodox world. The truth is, I don't really belong to any denomination. Not comfortably anyway. Reform and conservative Judaism? They often do a great job asking the hard questions, but too often it feels like they're more focused on what can be relaxed rather than what should be sacred. There's an emphasis on autonomy, progress, individual choice, but there's very little weight placed on covenant, on obligation, on continuity. And when that becomes the dominant mindset, Judaism tends to dissolve, not evolve. And at the same time, in the Orthodox world, there's strength, there's discipline, there's continuity, but also there's rigidity, and sometimes an insistence on theological claims that I can't honestly accept. If you can't believe in a dictated Torah from heaven, you're often treated like an outsider, even if you're living the same halachic life with the same reverence for the tradition. Now, Dennis Prager once made an interesting point. He suggested that the written Torah is divine and binding, but the oral Torah, that should evolve more with the times. And I get the instinct behind that. And in some ways, I agree with him. Yes, certain things do need to change, but where we part ways is in how that change happens. You can't just reinvent halacha on your own. That's not how Judaism has ever worked. If we're going to change something, it has to be through collective authority, through rabbinic consensus, through something like a Sanhedrin, not individual autonomy. So yes, while that structure exists, while we have no universally accepted authority to legislate change, we stick with what the rabbis have ruled. We honor the system. We keep the tradition alive. And we do it not in spite of questions, but because of them. Because the goal isn't to abandon the structure, the goal is to preserve it, even when asking the hardest questions it can handle. And then came October 7th. In one brutal, incomprehensible moment, all the lines we draw between each other, religious, secular, political, ideological, they shattered. What emerged instead was something raw, something ancient, something real. We remembered viscerally that we are one people, not because we agree, not because we practice the same, but because we are family. What moved me after that day wasn't the horror itself. It was what followed. Secular Jews, some who hadn't stepped foot in a synagogue in years, were rescuing others, fighting, dying al Kiddush Hashem. And religious Jews, who once saw those same secular Jews as distant, disconnected, now saw them as brothers, as fellow Jews. Not theoretical fellow Jews, but real ones. The kind you cry for, the kind you carry, the kind you bury. There was something sacred in that recognition. And it wasn't just symbolic. You could feel it in the tone of conversations, in the softness of the lines between us, in the way we started looking at each other differently. And no, it won't last in its rawest form. It never does. But people move on. The arguments return. The tribalism creeps back in. But not all of it fades. Memory stays. And that memory, that we were unified, that we stood together, that we saw each other clearly, that changes people even when they don't realize it. It becomes part of the story, part of our collective Jewish soul, just like the Exodus, just like Purim, just like the Holocaust. October 7th is now one of those moments, a rupture, a reckoning, a reminder of who we are. And I really hope, that it brings us just a little closer to the people who we're meant to be. If there's an idea I want to leave you with, it's this. Every Jew, no matter where they fall religiously, politically, culturally, every Jew writes a chapter. Some do it through halacha, some through culture, some through learning, some through sacrifice. But each of us leaves a mark on this story, the one that started thousands of years ago and somehow hasn't ended yet. It's tempting to put people in boxes. He's Hasidish, she's Yeshivish, that guy's modern Orthodox, that one's off the derech, they're secular, they're Mizrahi, they're not religious enough. But here's the truth. We're all part of that same soul, that same people, that same legacy. And that doesn't mean differences don't matter. They do. But it means we have to learn to see each other first and foremost as Jews, as brothers, as people who all in their own way are carrying the story forward. Even the ones we struggle to understand, except the Torah Karta. They can go away. But everyone else, they're part of this. Just like you are, just like I am. And maybe that's the whole point of wrestling with God, instead of surrendering to Him. Because the struggle, the tension, the questions, the effort to stay in relationship, even when we don't have all the answers, that is the relationship. And the story, it's still being written. I'm Amiel Cohen, and I hope this gave you something to think about in a new way.